Hi, good afternoon, everybody. We're just going to give everyone a little time to come into the presentation. We'll start in about 2 minutes.
Oops.
Kamran, I'm looking forward to this.
Oh, good.
Hello,
Whoever that
Doc-
was, I'm sorry. I'm just
Dr. Hawker.
Jillian.
all right. Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, I think we can. I think we can get started now. So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jane Bann. I'm the Vice Chair of Research for the Department of Medicine, and I'm hosting this citywide medical grand rounds. This is the round that has been allotted to the research portfolio this year. So thank you for coming. Just before we begin, I'd just like to remind you, please keep your mic muted when you're not speaking. It's just a better experience all around. And I just want to start by saying today's presenter is Dr. Kamran Khan, who's going to be talking to us about the pragmatic academic, a new era of entrepreneurship in academic medicine. So Cam has control of the slides. Cam, can you please advance it so we can do the land acknowledgement? We would like to begin with an acknowledgement of the land on which we work, study, and live. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the land upon which we work, which the work of the University of Toronto Department of Medicine is conducted. We acknowledge our presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Today, this land is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, work, and gather on these territories. Land acknowledgements are only a starting point for larger conversations. More concrete actions of restitution and transformations are necessary to address underlying inequities and discrimination in the distribution of resources between Canada's First Peoples and settlers. So Cam, can I have your title slide, please?
Oh, my title
okay.
slide. Oh,
Well, that's okay. Actually, yes, I think we've got at the end of this, please note that we have a option to fill in a evaluation of the talk.
Actually,
And,
Jane, sorry to
yeah.
interrupt. This is actually, I'm going to put the audience to work and ask some questions up front.
Oh,
So I would just ask folks to use this QR code or the link, and I think it's also in the chat, just because I'm going to ask some questions so I get a little bit of a sense of, where the audience's mindset is at when it comes to entrepreneurial activities.
great. I see Ramona's popped this into the chat, so that's fantastic. So everybody can interact. And then again, at the end of this, Ramona will also be putting a link in the chat for you to fill out an evaluation. So Cam, can we now please have your title slide? Perfect. So I just want to do a little introduction. I'm sure you all know who Dr. Kamran Khan is, but just for those of you who may not be familiar with his extensive work, he's an infectious disease physician and scientist at St. Michael's, and he's a professor of medicine at the University of Toronto. He's motivated by his experiences during the 2003 Toronto SARS epidemic. And he's been conducting research on global epidemics for over 2 decades, publishing landmark studies actually in the New England Journal, the Lancet Science and Nature. To translate and disseminate this scientific knowledge into timely action during public health emergencies, Dr. Khan founded Blue Dot, which is a global infectious disease intelligence company that helps governments and multinational enterprises strengthen their readiness and resilience to emerging biological threats. His research during public health emergencies has led him into numerous advisory roles, from the World Health Organization to the White House. Dr. Khan received a Governor General's Award for his work transcending clinical medicine, public health, big data, and artificial intelligence. And in 2021, he was appointed as the inaugural and very deserving Telemetry Health Nexus Chair in Innovation and Technology at the University of Toronto. So Cam, thank you very much for joining us today, and we really look forward to your presentation. Please get going.
Okay. Thank you, Jane, for the introduction. Thanks for inviting me. Jane and I, for many of you, have known each other in the tuberculosis clinic, actually at St. Mike's for quite some time, for quite a few years. And so I know when Jane and I were talking, I guess it was late last year, of just maybe a different kind of talk. So I promise you there will be no clinical practice guidelines in this presentation, but I wanted to talk about this idea of entrepreneurship in academic medicine. I think, I hear from a number of people who are kind of curious about what this might look like. Some are more than curious and are maybe taking steps down this path. And I thought what I would do is just share a little bit of my experience, as a clinician, contributing to the academic mission of the university through research and teaching and so forth, but also running a business as well, as the founder and CEO of Blue Dot for just over 11 years now, actually. So in terms of the learning objectives, I thought I would just talk a little bit about some of the challenges and opportunities with entrepreneurship in academic medicine. Wanted to share a little bit about my experience creating a business venture and doing this alongside my clinical and academic work. And then just talk a little bit about resources to support entrepreneurship within and adjacent and external to the University of Toronto. The ecosystem has evolved quite considerably in the last 10 plus years. And for those of you who may be thinking about, an idea you want to test, or maybe even just thinking, is entrepreneurship a possible path for you? I just want to give a little bit of a functional view of maybe where some places are to start. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, I just thought, not to be too pedantic here, but I just thought I wanted to start out with the definition of entrepreneurship that I'd like to use. The word innovation is used a lot, but I want to just really specifically talk about entrepreneurship being this process of creating and developing a new business venture with the idea of creating value. And I think we can all agree that a lot of our research and other academic endeavors are creating value, but we're actually monetizing the creation of that value to generate revenue. And at least in the case of a for-profit endeavor, to actually generate profits, which we can then use to put back into the business to do what other things that we want to do. Now, I also want to just call out and speak to social entrepreneurship briefly, just for those who may be not fully aware of the distinction. This could be an entire talk unto itself on this slide, but with social entrepreneurship, social enterprises, the primary mission is to address an important social challenge. Social enterprises can generate certainly revenue and generate profits, but they tend to be reinvested back into the business rather than being paid out to shareholders. So these types of businesses don't typically have venture capital investors and so forth. They're really focusing on using business as a vehicle to tackle an important social challenge. There are trade-offs between the two. That's not really the purpose of this presentation, but just as you're thinking about the word entrepreneurship, as I talk about it, these are a few different forms. So I'm going to pose a few questions. So I'm going to have you maybe go over to that link in Mentimeter. Let me stop sharing my screen for a second, because I have to go over to a web browser to get in to that. Where is my... Okay, so I see people are already populating responses. So, okay, so can you see my screen now? Jane, does that show up? Yeah, okay, great. So I think the first question I want to just pose is, would you consider participating in a health-related business venture? And when I say participate, what I'm really saying is, you don't have to start the business. You don't have to be the founder. You don't have to be someone who's playing a major leadership role, but you could be an employee. You could be a consultant. You could be on an advisory board. So I think what we're seeing here across the responses is we've got, about 20 or so of the, if my math is right here, about 31 responses leaning towards strongly agree and agree. Okay, so that's interesting, just to get a sense of where, people are not too averse to the idea of participating in a venture. Let's go to the next question. And this is, I would consider starting my own health-related business venture. So hopefully, again, I haven't used Mentimeter before, but hopefully on your device, there's a way to actually click in and put some of your responses in. Does question 2 show up somewhere on your devices? So Jane, you're
I
on
can
mute.
see, I can see it, Cam, and I've
Yeah.
entered I've submitted it. I'm not sure
Okay.
why it's not
Let me
showing
just
up.
try and
So
maybe refresh and see whether that does something. Okay. So since I can't see it, I'm curious, Jane, if you if you're able to help me out and see what.
yeah, let me just see here. I'm going to actually go over. Yeah, so this is question one. Let me see. Question two. Hold on a second. Just give me 1 second. Sorry, Cam.
Sure. Yeah.
Apologies to everyone here while we try and work this out.
Yeah, I haven't used Mentimeter before.
I am only seeing
Oh, maybe
question
it's under
one.
results. There we go. Let's see. Hopefully
Okay,
that
yeah.
does it. Nope, I still didn't do it. Okay. Um, well, how, Jane, you can't see the results, I guess, from your computer.
I'm only seeing for question one. I'm trying to figure out
Okay.
how to get to question two. If anybody on the call can actually see question two, can you please indicate such? And then what we can do is get you to add it up.
You know what?
Can
If it's not showing, can only see question one. Okay. Maybe it didn't work. That's okay. We won't worry about this. I'm just going to go through. You can see my screen. I'm just going to ask you to mentally think a little bit about how receptive would you be to actually starting your own venture where you're, either a co-founder, founder, actually playing a role leading the business or a major role. Okay, so we won't worry about the responses for right now. And I wanted to just also call out here what might be, if you were to go down this path, what would be the biggest incentive or motivator to say, yeah, that would push me over into pursuing some kind of entrepreneurial path in my career. So at the bottom are some of the responses that I want to just put forward. And I listed them alphabetically, so they're not necessarily oriented in any particular way. So the questions are one, creating financial rewards for myself, for my family, a learning opportunity, and learning in a dynamic environment, reducing dependence on public funding, scaling the impact of my work and seeing the impact of my work on people's lives, setting my own innovation priorities, or something else. So maybe when we come to the end, we could perhaps, if people want to, they can just type it into the chat or they can do it anonymously, whatever. But it'd be interesting just to kind of hear how people are thinking about your biggest incentive. Part of my motivation with the chair is just to understand a little bit more about how people are thinking about this. What are some barriers to entry and what are some motivators? So if we think about the disincentives, one might be, I just don't feel qualified. I don't know anything about running a business. It might pose risk to my clinical or academic career. There's too much uncertainty and risk of failure, and that's not necessarily something I'm receptive to. I don't have the time, or I'm unwilling to commit the time. The time trade-offs are like too considerable, or I just don't even know where to begin. I'm not even sure where I would start, or something else. So apologies, we couldn't do this dynamically and kind of see some of the results. But these are, I think, some important questions I think for us to try and understand in terms of for scientists and other academics, like what might be a motivation or what might be a barrier to entry for pursuing an entrepreneurial path. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go back to my slides. So apologies for that technical glitch there. I just did it with Slido and it worked. I'm not trying to make a pitch for Slido or anything, but there we go. So I think you could probably see my slides back up now. So, the question I wanted to pose here is like, why do I think this topic of entrepreneurship in academic medicine is important? And I think it's important for a few reasons. The world has changed considerably in the last 25 plus years. I've had the good fortune of being able to practice medicine in an academic institution it's hard to believe we're in the halfway through the 2020s, but over 3 decades, the 2000s, the 2010s, the 2020s, and a lot has changed in that time period. First of all, demands on the healthcare system have really evolved significantly. I'll say a few words about that. We know that economic conditions and the climate in terms of financial resources have become more constrained and more challenging. And I think there's certainly concerns about where things may be headed in the near future. But also, there's been very significant advances in scientific and technological capabilities that could allow us to do things far more effectively and efficiently, knowing that we're probably going to have to do more with less, but we could use technology and other innovations to be, again, more effective and more efficient. So I'm just going to start out a little bit by kind of talking about the system demands for a moment. And, I thought this was an interesting visual from the New York Times on, what the world looked like just from an age structure standpoint. And, I was class of 96 at U of T. And so like, this is kind of what the world looked like when I was a medical student. And you can see here that in Canada and much of the industrialized world, sort of the world is mostly working age populations. And then, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Asia were more younger populations. So if we sort of fast forward to where we are today, the world has become significantly older. The age structures have shifted. You can see places like Japan, which if any of you have visited Japan recently, kind of feel like the population is quite a bit older. It's almost visible, but we can certainly see in North America and Canada, like we've shifted over towards more older and aging populations. And if we project that a little bit further, we can see in the next, 2 decades or so, our population is going to age even further. And this is going to introduce new demands and new challenges on our healthcare system. Now, it's not just a gradual and incremental change. I mean, as an ID doc who's been in this area of emerging diseases, we're facing a growing number of health emergencies that we've had to deal with. Obviously, the pandemic being, a very recent one that we saw just the kind of disruptive impact that this can have. And we know that climate change and other factors are going to be creating more of these health emergencies as we go forward. In fact, just in the last 16 years, there have been 8 public health emergencies of international concern declared by the World Health Organization. So with some fairly simple math, that means like we're dealing with a global emergency every 2 years on average. So there are more of these coming. And so the demands on the system are really only likely to become more significant than they are today. Now, the flip side, when we look at this from an economic standpoint, I just want to share this slide here, which over, again, roughly a similar time frame over those 3 decades, is showing GDP growth and then health expenditures in terms of how that has changed over time. And you can see that, in some periods, health expenditures have been in excess proportionately relative to GDP growth. You can see if you're looking at 2020, with the pandemic, there was a decline in GDP, but also a significant uptick in health expenditures. And as we look forward, I think there are more concerns. There seems to be a lot of anxiety about this right now, new administration coming into the US and so forth, that like we may be facing slower economic growth, maybe even recessions going forward. And health expenditures are probably, again, going to have to deal with changing demographics, emergencies, and so forth. So this is kind of the reality that we are facing. Now, from a technology standpoint, there are many areas of innovation. I think it's worth calling out artificial intelligence because this is a transformative, I think, technology that can really augment human capabilities. Machines don't have to sleep. We can get them to do things around the clock and really point out to a human when perhaps an intervention or action is needed. Obviously, generate insights, make inferences based on diverse data. So this is really going to be a game-changing opportunity. And I think there have been some really exciting applications of this that we're already seeing. This is here coming out of some work that Dr. Verma and Mohammed Mamdani and colleagues here, you can see on this slide, have done in evaluating an ML-based early warning system for patient deterioration. And you can see some of the initial indications here that this is actually post-intervention in gray, that this is actually reducing mortality risk. And so here again, if we have fewer human resources, perhaps we can have machines that are analyzing data continuously and alerting a human that some intervention is required. So just one of a vast array of potential applications of artificial intelligence, but again, to augment human capabilities. So I wanted to just say, like, on one hand, when we think about the opportunities, they're vast. There is a really interesting paradox that's often referred to as Canada's innovation paradox. So if we look at, there's a recent report from the Canada Conference Board and Mars called Risky Business. And, what they highlight here is that amongst peer nations, more industrialized country, Canada actually ranks very high in terms of our capabilities. I mean, we have world-leading academic institutions. Our academic outputs are world-class. I mean, I think we probably all receive the emails about where the University of Toronto, for instance, stacks up in the world. There's a lot of talent. There's a lot of important discovery that's happening. So we're sort of second to the top. It's contrasted by the fact that we're second to the bottom amongst those nations in terms of fear of failure. And we're very reluctant, very hesitant to take on some of these opportunities, to look at ways to perhaps monetize the value that we're creating, going back to, the early point I made, and using those revenues as an opportunity to further drive the innovation agenda and to translate it into not just sustainable impact, but scalable impact that can be reaching lives and people across the globe. And so you can see here in this same report where Canada sort of stacks up in many of these countries. You can see us, I think we're 14th or something in this, just in terms of an index here on like which countries are perhaps most entrepreneurial. So we have a lot of raw talent. We have amazing universities. I think we have a growing ecosystem around innovation entrepreneurship, but there's still, I think, a cultural barrier, some mindset barriers that perhaps are maybe holding us back. Now, as individuals, we're not, likely to be motivated to say, hey, we need to solve Canada's innovation paradox. We're motivated by personal reasons to decide, well, do we want to do something or embark down an entrepreneurial path? And so what I thought I would do here is to shift a little bit from the context that's out there, just to share a little bit about the experience that I went through. I will say, completely accidental entrepreneur. I never, kind of went into this path thinking that was on my 5 or 10-year plan. It just sort of happened that way. And I thought what I'd do is I'd share a little bit of this experience, but also just speak to some of the things that I thought were true, but maybe weren't actually true, at least not for me. So I wanted to start out with how did this all begin? And I would say it began with what you hear many entrepreneurs say is like, there was an unmet need. There was some sort of gap. And, it was a decision about like, how do we address this gap? And for me, while I had been, as Jane had mentioned, I'd been studying epidemics and emerging diseases going back to SARS-CoV-1. It wasn't until the pandemic before COVID-19, 2009, a decade earlier with the flu pandemic. And I had been studying, global population mobility and working with the commercial airline industry and trying to understand how people move, how microbes move, and kind of trying to do this on a planetary scale. Published this work in the New England Journal back in 2009. It was the fastest I'd ever published a paper. From submission to actually in press was 2 weeks. So that's really, really fast. But what was remarkable is that when it actually was published, it was already out of date. Just because everything moved so quickly, it sort of felt like a retrospective view, a little less actionable. But it was interesting in that it started to lead to some government entities that were funding some of my research, including south of the border in the United States, taking an interest in saying, well, what if we, didn't just focus on producing scientific papers, but emergencies move faster than the academic cycles. Well, what if we actually built some technology to be able to operationalize this on a, real time or near real time basis? Of course, my thought was, I don't actually even know how to do that. I did have the good fortune of being introduced to Rafi Hofstein and Joel Lederman at what was called Mars Innovation in the day. It's now TAP. Some of you may be familiar. And, their comment was, I think you need a business if you want to actually do this. And then, of course, my comment was like, what do I know about running a business? So this, they kind of challenged me to reflect on an important decision, which is, do I actually want to go down this path? And so I'll just share with you a little bit of the mindset that I was in at the time. The first thought was, I am grossly unqualified to do this. I do not know anything about running a business. So I shouldn't, this just doesn't make sense. Maybe I need to go back to school. I think I said, should I go get my MBA and come back? Rafi's response was, you don't have time to get your MBA. You can get it on the job and learn. And like, think of this as a growth opportunity. I basically say, I don't know where to begin. Their comment was, okay, we can help you navigate through what some of the stages and opportunities are and to think through how you would approach this. I think a really important question for me was, do I have the time? I had three young kids at the time. My daughter was 7, my twins were 4, three kids. This was a lot to think about. And then the question was, well, maybe I could really think carefully about how I use my time, align it with things that I value most. The risk of failure was knowing most businesses, half of them don't survive 5 years, only a third make it to 10 years in the services sector. So do I want to take that? Then the other thought was, I remember reading something from Mark Twain's, 20 years from now, you'll regret the things you didn't do more than the things you did. And so that was, okay, maybe I shouldn't worry too much about that. Career risks, will this actually hinder my academic career? But I didn't know if that was true. Then the question was, maybe actually it's not. Maybe it's an opportunity. Um, and then knowing this is high volatility, this is not for everyone, but maybe I could learn a little bit more about resilience and withstanding, operating in a very uncertain environment. And it's interestingly, I thought doing well was a negative. I thought that if I generated revenue, it would delegitimize the, you know, credibility of the academic work I was doing. But, an interesting point was, well, if you want to continue to do good, you may need to create a sustainable business model to be able to do that. And so doing well in some sense or form is a precursor to doing good on a sustainable or scalable basis. So these were the kind of dilemmas that I was going through and thinking through. But I did want to share one of the things that I found to be very helpful. And I think for those of you who might be contemplating this, is in an academic environment, you're very different as an entrepreneur or an aspiring entrepreneur than someone who's doing this out of their basement or their garage, because you are actually operating within an academic institution. You might have lab space or other things. And so I really tested and validated the market. I actually went to some of my funders and said, would you become our first customer? And eventually I got them to agree to that and brought on a few customers just like right at the time of commercializing and sort of creating the company and then having some customers right out of the gates. And so I think we have this opportunity in the academic environment to be able to sort of further test and validate the market. Now, on one hand, you don't want to sit at the edge of the pool forever. You've got to jump in at some point in time, but timing is important, and you have a certain safe environment that you can actually further continue your research or advance your innovation, but at the same time really assess market conditions, because once you start, you've got to now maintain this entity. You've got to actually take care of it, and that involves work and effort. So finally, just took the leap of faith, decided, okay, I think Rafi's point was like, you just get to decide whether you're going to go ahead or not, and took that leap of faith. Grateful to have worked with people like Art Slutsky, who was the VP of Research, and supportive of this. Brought on some early seed venture capital and just got things started. I could spend, hours just talking about this process, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to sort of continue on and just we'll leave the tactics and mechanics. I think for a lot of you, I suspect maybe you're just curious about entrepreneurship, thinking about it, or maybe at an earlier stage. I could be wrong. There may be folks who are much further along, but I'm happy to talk about just some of my experiences if people wanted to chat after the presentation. and then really just started to create value. So how did this actually play out? First I was using, public funds to advance the research, to develop it, create some intellectual property and protect that intellectual property. And then ultimately, that led to the creation of opportunities to produce what I would call services revenue. So just if you think of it as like a restaurant, it was kind of like I had a restaurant, but there was no menu. Like someone would come in and say, like, I want beef stroganoff and I want like, apple pie with vanilla ice cream. And then I'd have to go to the grocery store, buy all the ingredients, make everything. So it's a place to start, but it's not clearly a place to scale. And then ultimately kept building based on feedback from the market, my vision for what was needed, started to build a platform and technology, and have really shifted the business. Today is 95% subscription revenue. So it's kind of like Netflix, monthly you pay your subscription and you use the platform. And so this becomes more scalable because you can then start to bring clients and customers onto your platform. You have a menu, it's very clear. And if someone wants to push you off the menu, it's going to cost. They're going to have to, pay for that additional effort if they really want it. But otherwise, it allows you to stick to your core strength and your core capability. So this was just the general model of how, started to monetize some of this work. And I do want to say, proud of some of the impact that we've had over the years. This is a slide here looking at cases of SARS-CoV-2 in COVID-19 from Hopkins website. Taiwan CDC had become one of our clients in late 2019, and their request was, we're kind of this island. We've got to look around the planet for emerging threats, and we've got to understand how do we anticipate those threats and what kind of interventions do we take at our ports of entry, et cetera. And one of the testimonials we got here was that our intel picking up this unusual respiratory syndrome in Hubei province in China, plus the understanding of literally how those places were connected to Taiwan, specifically Taipei, really empower them to take actions immediately. And we're not taking, credit for this, but you can see they basically avoided the pandemic early on for the first couple of years. And, part of their comments is that they felt that this timely intelligence helped them make a high stakes, time sensitive decision, which had profound implications to the health of the population. Their economy grew while most of the world's economies were in free fall. And of course, they avoided a lot of the social disruption that many of us in the world experienced during the pandemic. We also were called into action in response to the state of California's emergency with the first stay-at-home orders. We had a whole platform for analyzing anonymized mobile device location data, which supported the state's emergency response to the stay-at-home orders and gave dynamic near real-time feedback on where public health interventions and finite resources would be most impactful. So these are just a couple of examples of how some of this came into being and the kind of impact it has had. So I'm going to just lastly say, in terms of my experience, trying to enjoy the ride. And like there are days that I'm like more like the person on the right where it's like, hey, this is great. And the wind's blowing in your face and it's very exciting. And then there are other days where you're thinking you're gonna vomit and you want to get off the ride. And then that could be the same day as well. And so it is challenging. It is a bumpy ride. I would say it is not for everyone because there's a lot of volatility, a lot of uncertainty. But the other part of it is entrepreneurship doesn't mean you have to be on the front row. Like you could be further back and you don't have to necessarily be taking on all of the responsibilities. So things I learned that I thought were true, and I'll just share my experience. People may have different truths here of like what is true for them. It was absolutely true. I was grossly unqualified to start a business. I did not know anything about this. But I will say I've learned a ton in this process and things that I wouldn't necessarily learn in the classroom. There are just some things that are just like hard things and you just have to go through them. They're not necessarily something you can learn in the classroom, but I've learned a lot. The path was absolutely unclear. There is a growing ecosystem of people who are enablers who want to help support folks to navigate through these opportunities. I do want to point out the time trade-offs. These are very real. 3 young kids, I feel like between clinical work, academic work, like I definitely sacrificed a lot of time. There were personal rewards, fulfillment, satisfaction of the work we're doing. There are also, financial benefits and so forth of being part of a company. The risk of failure is constantly there. It doesn't change. It doesn't go away if you've been in business for 5 or 10 years. Big businesses fail. Market conditions change. The competitive landscape changes. The technological landscape changes. You're constantly reinventing yourself to adapt to conditions and needs that are out there. But on the other hand, I wouldn't have traded this. I think I've learned a lot, and I will always certainly look back and value this experience that I've gone through. I thought this was going to pose risks to my career just intuitively, but it actually didn't. It actually accelerated things. And, I went forward on promotion with both research as a clinician scientist, but creative professional activity. And it actually, I mean, I wasn't in the committee, but I mean, I think the feedback I got was there was important scientific research that was produced, but also real world impact, kind of a creative business model. And I think in terms of publications, I just disclosed conflicts. I was initially kind of like, how do I do this? I just disclosed what my commercial interests were, and I don't know. I didn't necessarily feel like it was a big barrier. I just let everyone know where I stood, and it didn't seem to have a major impact on sort of perception there. Definitely, this is high volatility. I would say it's not for everyone. I think I've learned a lot about resilience. I'm part of a peer group of other founders, and I feel like I've learned a lot from others on how you manage that uncertainty and volatility. And I feel like doing well and generating revenue has been really valuable to be able to do the work that I think is impactful and meaningful and sustain it and grow it over time. So, where I'm going to kind of conclude is just a little bit about for those of you who are contemplating this kind of path, there is a complex ecosystem. I think when I started, Mars Innovation, now TAP were there, the Ontario Centers of Excellence, now it's called the Ontario Centers of Innovation, were around. A lot of these other entities didn't necessarily exist or were in a different form at that point in time. But I think the big question and challenge is, okay, like where do I begin? There's like hospital-based, incubators and so forth. There's stuff that's within the university, adjacent to the university, government programs, industry entities. I guess I would say if someone was thinking about where to start, the way I would approach this is I would probably, one, talk to your tech transfer office, but two, these two programs, I think, are particularly noteworthy. Yes, some of you might, be in UTest or in CDL, and it's not that you go into one or the other. You might be in multiple different organizations here. But I wanted to highlight Lab to Market because I think the first question is entrepreneurship even something that I would consider? And the Discover program at Lab to Market is one that actually allows you to ask some of those questions and to just kind of dip your toe, if you will, into this and get a feel for if this is right for you. Now, this is a cohort-based program. It's a little more oriented, I would say, toward trainees and recent graduates. Many of you might have folks in your labs that might be interested. You can see the dates and times for the ones that are forthcoming. There's also a Lab to Market Foundations for Physicians that is being created, and it's coming out in the spring. I've put down Sophie Stewart Shepherd's email address. You can also email me. We're both participating in that program because we know that physicians have a slightly different reality, especially if they're still clinically practicing. And this is oriented to try and speak to the principal investigators, the clinicians, and so forth themselves. So these are a few. This is one resource you may think about, and the other is H2I, the Health Innovation Hub. This is not rolling in for a particular cohort over X number of weeks. It's asynchronous. You can see where the link is to join. You can stay there as long as you'd like. It's based within U of T, but it's open to anyone in healthcare or medicine. And I think it helps you with navigation of the ecosystem to know which resources you should go to based on your functional needs. And they have a very diverse mix of educational programming, but also operational programming. Like, how do you apply for SRED claims? How do you protect your, develop your IP strategy? So there's a very diverse set of opportunities. So these are two that I would probably direct people to. And again, you can always reach out to me. I'm happy to hear a little bit about maybe your thoughts or be a sounding board. But I think also some of you might just like to read, and I've certainly have read and learned a lot. And I just wanted to share with you three books that I would just recommend if you're contemplating this path, because I feel like they've been really helpful for me in orienting my mindset. Now, one of them is, and we hear this a lot, I think when I started, I heard like, you've got to learn how to say no. But most of us are yes people. Most of us are like, we can do people. When someone asks us to do something, we say yes, of course, we want to help out. But I think the reality is every time you say yes, you're actually saying no to something else. So you've just got to really think about that. And every time you say no, you're really giving yourself the opportunity to say yes to something else. This doesn't mean you can say no graciously and so forth. But this book in particular, I found to be very thought-provoking. It's simple, it's short, it asks you questions that really help you understand what you value most. And it really sets the bar for, as the title says, like you are so enthusiastic about this or you're not doing it. And when you have finite time, you've got to make some of those key decisions. So one thought for folks who might be thinking about it, it's actually, I think, a valuable exercise, even if you're not going down the entrepreneurial path. I think the second was I kind of came from, and I suspect maybe many of us in medicine, we've been successful in our careers, top of our class, et cetera. Like perfection and excellence is kind of how we think about things. This just has not been my experience that you just get it right or you get perfection right out of the gates. This is one of those things where is adaptive learning. You have a hypothesis, you rapidly run an experiment, you test, you determine whether your hypothesis is valid or invalid. You use that as feedback and you keep going. And so, some might say you get 1% better week over week. I've heard some say like you suck a little bit less every week because when you're starting, everything seems like it's, it's not working well, but you just incrementally start to get there. But you just striving for perfection is like not the way to go. Just getting better and better incrementally over time and consistently. And this book, I think, it's a really important one and a sort of a classic for the lean startup. And the last I want to just leave you with is I think speaking about volatility and the mental health impacts. I just gave a talk at CAMH this morning on this issue, and like it's real. When I talk to other founders, the mental health impacts are profound because we're trying to control everything, right? We want to control whether that prospect becomes a customer. We want to control the outcome of our investor pitch. We want to control all these things, but the reality is that not everything is in our control. And if we direct our energy toward things that are out of our control, we leave ourselves susceptible to a lot of unhappiness. So I kind of learned and discovered a bit of philosophy here, ancient philosophy. This is Stoic philosophy. But I think if you want to go down this path, you need some life philosophy to anchor yourself because it is a bumpy ride and it's not for everyone. I feel like this has helped me be a better entrepreneur, but also just like a better human as well. So I am going to just wrap up there. Just mindful, I wanted to leave time for questions and so forth. But I think what I'd like to just conclude with is going back to the earlier point that there is a deep and profound need for us to be creative and to address some of the challenges that the healthcare system is facing today and will face in the future. We're probably going to have to do this with less resources, I suspect, but we can innovate, use scientific and innovations and technological innovations to do things more effectively. And I think for the benefit of not just seeing the impact of our work, in Canada and around the world, but also to have a business vehicle and a business model that allows us to sustain itself and scale itself. It doesn't mean that it may live indefinitely. It just means that it's a different model where you're not specifically or solely reliant on the public purse for funding some of the important work that you're doing. So with that, I think I will conclude and happy to take questions or comments or feedback. So
Well, thanks so much, Cam. That was amazing. And congratulations on all the success you've had and the impact you've had, because it is truly spectacular. We're all very proud of you. Anyway, I'm going to try and look at all the hands here. Druvner, I see your hand first.
Thanks, Jane. Thanks, Cameron. Amazing talk. Really helpful and relevant, I think, for a lot of us to hear your path. My question was, you touched on this a little bit when you talked about kind of career risks and how things might be perceived, and a little bit on the conflicts of interest and disclosing things. Like, how do you navigate? I still think, at least the perception to me, in an academic environment, and I think partially in a Canadian environment and not in the States where healthcare innovation is a lot more normalized, I think there is this taboo of there's the conflict of interest that comes from some of the financial pieces of entrepreneurship, which is real. And then there's, this taboo of any potential personal financial gain. So I think, what you described really nicely is this. I think the easier pitch is I'm doing good. I'm building. I'm not reliant on grants. I'm not reliant solely on public funding to build something scalable. And I think that's an easy story that people,
yeah.
it makes total sense. But then there's the piece of, well, what if also I have some personal financial gain from this, and managing the taboo, and do you feel like that in some ways people view it as delegitimate?
I think maybe Dhruv might have frozen. I don't think that's me, right?
Yeah,
Dhruv,
no,
I think I got the question. Sorry, you froze there at the last little moment. But I think I got the question really. And maybe, just sharing a few perspectives on this. I think a lot of this comes down to culture, right? And I will say I did my postgraduate training in New York and in Boston, and I did see a lot of the professors, just interestingly, who had other companies, industry partnerships, and so forth. So there was a little bit of kind of, I thought it was odd. I mean, I was at U of T and graduated in 96, and I don't remember hearing about company creation and so forth at that time. And that was, a different era. That's like 20, almost 30 years ago. Um, but I definitely saw a culture that was more accepting of the idea that doing well and doing good are not a zero-sum game, which I think we kind of have almost entrenched in our minds, that like if we do well, it is somehow in conflict with doing good. And but I think that's a reflexive, it's just kind of like it's a knee-jerk reaction. But I think if you fundamentally, my feeling is as you dig deeper into that, I don't know that that necessarily needs to be true. And so I think if you bring your values with you, that doing well and doing good are connected with one another. It's a prerequisite. I think many probably around the table here or this virtual meeting room probably understand that, the challenges of securing public funding and so forth. But I hear what you're saying, the personal gains. I mean, we get paid a salary for coming in creating value. I mean, to me, I think this is also creating value. I don't see any issue with this. But I think it's a cultural barrier, and it's very different in the United States than it is in Canada. And I think hopefully these kinds of conversations may be able to allow us to reshape our thinking. And I will say, I think in the last 10 years, our thinking has shifted. It's not the same. It is evolving.
Thanks.
Cam, there's a couple of questions in the chat I'm just going to bring up now. Steve Lipinski, great talk. This is a huge success story. Any idea what percentage of this type of initiative is actually successful?
Yeah. Yeah, there's been some interesting publications that have come out recently, and the numbers are kind of interesting. That in this, if you're producing goods, those businesses tend to be more successful, where you're producing actual tangible products. But the services sector, it's roughly just over half of businesses survive to 5 years, and then about a third of businesses make it to 10 years. And then beyond that, it just continues to decline from there. So they're tough, and they're tough certainly at an early stage. So, I think at the end of the day, I'm not sure if the question is just mindset of like, what's the probability of success or failure? Um, but I do think going back to Dhruva's comment about culture, redefining failure is, I think, something that's important for us, that seeing if something where maybe the business model doesn't work, um, but we've learned something. In the same way that if we run an experiment, we might actually find out that our hypothesis was wrong. I mean, this is, I think, analogous in some ways, but that's just to give you a little bit of sense of the numbers.
And then there's another comment here from Karen Quinn. Great presentation, very inspiring and terrifying. Do you think the career risk consideration differs for those of us at different stages of our academic career? For example, early versus mid. And you were pretty early, right, Cam, when you started?
Yeah, I was I think I was still an assistant professor when I started Blue Dots in 2013. Yeah, I think that's right. I can't remember now, but so I think I was kind of coming up around the time or I might have been an associate. I'm sorry. I think I was an associate professor at the time, not a full professor. And so, um, yeah, I don't want to say that this is, my own experience was that it didn't actually hinder my ability to produce academic outputs. I just had more disclosures. A lot of other academic institutions wanted to have partnerships with Blue Dot for data, publishing, and so forth. I think I also wanted to speak to the whole promotion process and creative professional activity as a category for now how we think about folks who are drawn outside the lines, and just doing things that are a little bit different, but are also valuable. And I don't know, maybe Jillian might want to sort of speak to that, but I think that is an important thing that we need to communicate to folks who are thinking about their career that, risk taking can also be something that is part of the path. But I think the perception might be that it's too risky. I don't know. And I will say, I've also heard a lot of folks say, like, can I be an academic or an entrepreneur, or is it an and? And so I think these are some of the conflicts and the dilemmas that I think people face. But I would just say, like, more and more creative professional activity, I think we're seeing applications where people are doing things just outside of the more conventional, research grant dollars, H-index and so forth, teaching. Um, so I think making more latitude for that is going to have a trickle down effect.
Thanks, Cam. There's a lot in the chat, so I'm going to just try and catch the top ones here. Don Riddlemeyer's lovely talk. Some survivor bias.
Yeah.
Any tips or tricks about handling failures?
Yeah. Look, some survivor bias, what I will say, and I mentioned, you never, like, that risk never goes away. I mean, big companies, Blockbuster, Kodak, like, they all went out of business as well, right? I think of one thing I learned from my mom when I'm one of four. She was like, when you were young kids, we had little problems. When you became big kids, we had big problems. I guess it's kind of the same thing with the business. It's like it only just seems to the challenges evolve. I guess at the end of the day, to me, from a failure standpoint, I think there's a redefining failure. Like, failure is only a failure if we define it as such. Otherwise, I think it's a learning opportunity, it's a lesson. I think we've got to be willing to accept that some things don't necessarily go the way that we would expect, especially if we're innovating, if we're creating something new that hasn't existed before. I think there's got to be a bit more tolerance. But I realize, like, how we feel about it, how we think our peers feel about failure. Like, this is a big motivator, and that's or a barrier for folks perhaps to pursue some of these opportunities. And I think everyone just has to kind of come to a certain level of comfort with it. But I do think that the culture being more accepting of risk taking. I will say, when I was in the US, I felt like a lot of the professors who had failed ventures, like, they wore that like a badge of honor. They were just like, yeah, I've got battle scars here, here, and here. And this I would have thought folks would have just, like, maybe been really hush about it, but like, they just kind of owned it and were like, this is part. So it's a different culture. So that's my thought about failure.
Thanks, Cam. There's a couple of other really good questions here, so
Sure.
I'd like to just keep going. Great talk, interesting. Canada ranks low in terms of entrepreneurial initiatives. Do you know of if there are higher barriers, for example, legislation in Canada in comparison to other countries that contributes to this problem?
There's certainly been a lot of debate about things like some of the capital gains legislation, which I don't think it's like been fully implemented. Obviously, I think the federal government has a few things to sort of work through at the moment, but certainly also R&D expenditures relative to other countries. So there are certainly policy implications. And I think we've generally been kind of falling behind when it comes to investing in R&D relative to many of the other peer nations that I talked about. So I think there are the incentives for venture capital, the incentives for entrepreneurs. So yes, there are a multitude of possible, areas of policy that we should be thinking about. And I would just say I'm not the expert on the policy side of things, but I know that there are a wide range of different organizations that are trying to create policies that are more conducive to allow people to kind of lower the barrier to entry, and to be far more willing to take some of those risks. And that includes not just the entrepreneurs, but venture capital and also sort of the markets themselves, the customer base themselves. I do want to maybe just go one rung below as well as we talk about policies. I do want to also, call out the institutions and IP policies, because that can be also a barrier to entry for an aspiring entrepreneur to think about, okay, I don't own the intellectual property. I've got to negotiate it. And then like, what am I giving up? And so I would just encourage to everyone, the innovators and entrepreneurs and the researchers, the VPs of research and innovation, either at the hospital or the university, that it's the size of the pie that matters, not the percentage. One thing I learned early on was I was just so obsessed about, well, what percentage do I own? But the reality is 100% times zero is still zero. So growing the size of the pie and letting others participate and allowing you to play to your unique strengths, letting them play to their unique strengths. I think this was something that I ultimately end up learning is that's really the name of the game. But I think too often it's either the institutions or the scientists themselves are kind of thinking about proportions. I think the mindset should be around what's the growth of the opportunity. So that's one rung down in policy. It's sort of like hospital level institutional policies, but something for us to think about.
Okay, and then just a couple, I know we're running close to time here, but I don't want to lose this opportunity to get you because we have you here. So we're going to hold you, okay? A question on Canadian venture capitalists are more interested in minerals and resource development rather than biotech. Do you have any advice for Canadian venture capitalists? That's Mario Ostrowski. So I'm not sure if Mario's got something in the books or cooking.
Yeah. First of all, let me just say I am also around after this talk. So if anyone wants to chat, I'm more than happy to sit over a coffee, have a conversation. I think to Mario's question, I think it's shifting. I mean, I think there's more, I guess there's VCs within Canada, but your investors don't have to be based within Canada. There's US based investors, there's other international based investors. So I think what you want to do is you want to find investors that align with your values and your vision. I think that's really important because, so I first of all say, I think there's a growing number of opportunities for venture capital, but I think it's finding the right alignment because just like with any relationship, if you get into a relationship and you're not aligned on values, you're going to have a whole bunch of problems that you're going to have to work through later on. So understanding, is this investor, are they an impact investor? Are they just like about the ROI? Like just understanding those things up front. But I do agree with you in the current climate where we are today, there was an era of like far more abundance and venture capital flowing very freely. I think the economic conditions today are such that the pendulum has swung from like top line growth to bottom line growth. And so I think there's a lot, capital is far more expensive to access today than it was previously. But these go through cycles, so I think that probably will change again. But I think to Mario's question is like there are lots of opportunities, but and they don't have to necessarily be in Canada to maintain a Canadian held corporation status, which there are lots of benefits to doing so.
Cam, I think we're coming to the end. I just have I don't see any other points, so I'll just ask a question
Sure.
of you that I have. So I've done a lot of work with engineers, and this gets back to the culture of whether or not you're an entrepreneur. So I would say that the engineering actually faculty is of
Yeah.
full of grad students, even not just professors, but grad students, postdocs who are launching companies left, right, center. So it's unclear to me if that is and so I'm not sure it's culture across the board. Is it cultural differences between us and engineers, or alternatively, much of theirs is product based versus services based? So can you just
Yeah.
comment on where you think the difference lies, or
It's
if you
a
know?
it's a really, really good question, Jane, and I think it's probably how we view health. Because I would agree across other faculties, people are just like far more willing to say, hey, I'm just building this widget, this technology, I'm going to license the IP. Don't think twice about it. I think it's how we value health. And it goes back to the one of the first comments is it okay to profit, to have some profit in a health related entity or organization or venture? And I think that's where we're less comfortable with that particular issue. I think in the US and in other countries, they're more comfortable with it. I'm not here to say like that we should or we shouldn't be. I think it's just like it is a different there's a different cultural dimension within the health and medicine space, I think, than there are in other areas. Personally, I mean, my own personal belief is like I don't think again doing well and doing good have to be in conflict with one another, especially when we think of the fact that the landscape in medicine is changing rapidly. Whose values should be embedded in the innovations for tomorrow? It's probably healthcare providers who went into this to have an impact, right? Um, and I think we can play a really important role there, and doing so that it's in ways that are creating jobs. We've created hundreds of jobs at Blue Dot. We've generated tens of millions in revenue. People have started their lives. They've acquired new skills. They've gone on to do their own next thing. I don't think that's a bad thing. Yeah. So, and contributed to the public purse through taxes and all the rest. So I don't think these things have to be bad, but I think intuitively or just reflexively, we kind of maybe see profit in health as being something that we're less tolerant of.
Thank you, Cam. I don't see any other hands up right now or any other comments in the chat other than to say thank you. That people have